Dr. Victoria Hayes stared at the phone in her trembling hands, the words from the doctor echoing in her mind like a death sentence. Your daughter needs a kidney transplant. We need to contact her father immediately. The only problem? Alexander Sterling, tech billionaire worth over $3 billion, had no idea he even had a daughter. 8 years ago, Victoria had walked in on him with another woman and disappeared without a trace. Now she had to make the most impossible phone call of her life. But let me tell you how we got here, because this isn't just any love story. This is about the choice between pride and saving the person you love most. It started with morning fog rolling off San Francisco Bay and a phone call that would destroy everything Victoria had built. She stood in her corner office at Hayes & Associates Architecture, overlooking the financial district's gleaming towers, reviewing plans for her latest sustainable housing project when her phone buzzed. Riverside Elementary flashed on the screen, and her blood turned to ice. Dr. Hayes, this is Principal Martinez. Sophia collapsed during PE class. She's unconscious. The paramedics are taking her to UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital. The architectural blueprints scattered like broken dreams as Victoria grabbed her keys. 8-year-old Sophia, the daughter Alexander Sterling had never known existed, was fighting for her life. The drive through San Francisco's steep streets felt endless. Victorian houses of Pacific Heights blurred past as Victoria navigated the narrow lanes, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The Mediterranean revival architecture of UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital rose before her like a fortress of hope and terror. Victoria burst through the main entrance, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floors. My daughter, Sophia Hayes. She was brought in by ambulance. Room 314, Dr. Hayes. Dr. Jennifer Kim is with her now. Victoria found her daughter surrounded by machines and medical equipment that seemed to dwarf her small frame. Sophia's usually vibrant brown eyes were clouded with exhaustion, her olive skin pale against the white hospital linens. The sight made Victoria's chest constrict with a fear she'd never known. Mommy, Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible above the humming machines. I'm here, baby. Victoria took her daughter's small hand, fighting to keep her voice steady. How are you feeling? Really tired. And my back hurts. Dr. Kim, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, approached them with the careful demeanor of someone bearing terrible news. Dr. Hayes, I'm Dr. Kim, Sophia's nephrologist. We need to discuss some very concerning test results. Nephrologist. Victoria's medical knowledge was limited, but she knew enough to be terrified. That's kidneys. Yes. Sophia is presenting with advanced chronic kidney disease. Both kidneys are functioning at less than 10% capacity. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. But she's only 8. How is this possible? Pediatric kidney disease can develop silently over months or even years. Children are remarkably adaptable and often show few symptoms until the condition becomes quite advanced. Dr. Kim's voice was gentle but direct. We need to start dialysis immediately to stabilize her condition. What are our options? What do we do next? Dr. Kim pulled up a chair beside them, and Victoria knew the news was about to get worse. Dialysis will keep Sophia stable in the short term, but it's not a permanent solution for a child her age. She needs a kidney transplant. Then we do that. We get her on the list. The pediatric transplant waiting list can be several years long, Dr. Hayes. Even then, there's no guarantee we'll find a suitable match. Dr. Kim paused, choosing her words carefully. The best option is a living donor, preferably a blood relative. The compatibility rate is significantly higher with family members. Victoria's mouth went dry. She remembered being tested for everything when Sophia was born, during those lonely months in Boston when she'd convinced herself she could raise her daughter alone. I know my blood type. We're not compatible. What about Sophia's father? The question hung in the sterile air like a death sentence. Victoria closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 26 again, standing in the doorway of that Boston hotel suite, watching the man she loved with another woman in his arms. Alexander Sterling, tech billionaire. Forbes estimated his net worth at over $3 billion. The man who'd made her believe in fairy tales before crushing them beneath his handmade Italian leather shoes. The man who'd never known he had a daughter because Victoria had been too proud, too hurt, to tell him. Dr. Hayes? Dr. Kim's voice brought her back to the present. Victoria stared at the floor, her voice barely a whisper. Sophia's father and I aren't in contact. I understand that family situations can be complex, but Dr. Hayes, we're talking about your daughter's life. That night, alone in Sophia's hospital room, Victoria watched her daughter sleep. The dialysis machine hummed softly beside the bed, and Sophia looked impossibly fragile connected to all those tubes and monitors. Her dark hair, the exact shade of Alexander's, fanned across the white pillow like spilled ink. Mommy! Sophia's voice was soft, drowsy from medication. I'm right here, sweetheart. Am I really sick? Victoria smoothed her daughter's hair away from her face, the simple gesture threatening to break her composure entirely. Yes, baby, but Mommy's going to make sure you get better. Promise. The word was a dagger to her heart. I promise. Sophia smiled sleepily, her eyes already closing. I love you, Mommy. I love you too, more than all the stars in the sky. As Sophia drifted back to sleep, Victoria pulled out her phone with trembling hands. She kept his number all these years, though she couldn't explain why. It was saved simply as if even typing his full name would give him too much power over her carefully guarded heart. Alexander Sterling, the man who'd taught her what passion felt like when he'd walked into her firm's Boston office to discuss a smart city collaboration. The man whose daughter was fighting for her life 3 feet away from her. Victoria stared at the phone screen for what felt like hours. Every rational part of her mind told her to make the call. But the broken heart that still lived in her chest whispered all the reasons she couldn't. He'd called her a distraction. His biggest mistake. She'd built a life without him, raised their daughter without him, succeeded in her career without him. Did she really want to let him back into their carefully constructed world? But then Sophia shifted in her sleep, and the dialysis machine beeped its mechanical rhythm, and Victoria knew she didn't have a choice. Her finger hovered over the call button. She pressed it. It rang once. Twice. Sterling. His voice, deep and commanding with that slight New England accent from his Harvard days, sent electricity shooting through her nervous system. In one word, she was transported back to every whispered conversation, every passionate argument, every moment of pure joy she'd felt in his arms. Alexander. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. The silence that followed felt eternal. She could hear him breathing, could almost feel his shock reverberating through the phone connection. Victoria. His voice was stunned, disbelieving. After all this time, why are you calling? I need to see you, Alexander. If this is about what happened in Boston, it's not about us, Alexander. It's about your daughter. The silence this time was deafening. She could picture him in his corner office, probably still working despite the late hour, his hand frozen halfway to his coffee cup. My what? Sophia. She's 8 years old and she's dying. And according to the doctors, you might be her only chance. Alexander Sterling stood in his corner office on the 47th floor of Sterling Tower in downtown San Francisco, staring out at the bay through floor-to-ceiling windows. The city's tech elite called this view the $1 million perspective, but all he could see was the reflection of a man who'd just learned he was a father. 8 years, he whispered to the empty office, his voice breaking on the words. I have a daughter, and I didn't even know she existed. Years of unspoken pain echoed in Alexander's sharp intake of breath. A daughter, he said again, as if testing the word. You never told me. Alexander, I can explain. 8 years, Victoria. 8 years of her life, and I didn't know she existed. His voice was rising now, that familiar intensity bleeding through his carefully controlled English. How could you keep this from me? Victoria felt her own carefully maintained composure crack. Don't you dare. Don't you dare make this about your wounded feelings when my baby is lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life. Our baby, he corrected, his voice raw with emotion. She's our baby, isn't she? The possessiveness in his tone made her heart clench painfully. Yes. She's yours. What's wrong with her? What kind of sick? Tell me everything. Despite everything between them, Victoria could hear genuine anguish in his voice. She explained Sophia's condition, the kidney failure, the need for a transplant, the compatibility issues that made family members the best hope for a match. Alexander listened without interrupting, and she could almost see him pacing his penthouse apartment, his mind already racing through solutions, timelines, resources. I'll be on the next flight, he said without hesitation. I'll be there tomorrow. Alexander, you don't understand. No, you don't understand. His voice carried the steel that had built a tech empire. I have a daughter who needs me. Nothing else matters. The line went dead, leaving Victoria staring at her phone with shaking hands. What had she done? In less than 24 hours, the carefully constructed life she'd built for herself and Sophia was about to be turned upside down by the one man she'd never been able to forget. Alexander Sterling didn't just arrive in San Francisco. He descended on UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital like a force of nature. Victoria heard him before she saw him, his voice carrying down the corridor as he spoke rapid-fire into his phone, undoubtedly rearranging his entire life with the efficiency that had made him one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs. When he rounded the corner, Victoria's breath caught in her throat. 8 years had only made him more devastating. His dark hair was shorter now, styled perfectly despite the red-eye flight. His charcoal suit was wrinkled from travel, but he still moved with that confident stride that had first caught her attention in a crowded Boston conference room. His green eyes, the same eyes Sophia had inherited, found hers across the waiting room, and the world seemed to stop spinning. Victoria, he said, her name a question and a statement and a prayer all at once. Alexander. They stood there for a moment, drinking each other in across 8 years of silence. He looked older, more mature, but that dangerous magnetism that had drawn her to him like a moth to flame was still there, crackling between them despite everything that had happened. Where is she? His voice was gentler now, uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. Where's our daughter? The word "or" sent a shiver through her that she tried to suppress. She's sleeping. Alexander, before you meet her, we need to talk. We need to talk? His laugh was bitter, edged with pain. We should have talked 8 years ago, Victoria, before you disappeared without a trace. Before you robbed me of 8 years of my daughter's life. You want to do this here? In a hospital corridor. I want to do this wherever you'll finally tell me the truth. Why did you leave, Victoria? Why did you vanish like I meant nothing to you? The hurt in his voice almost broke her resolve, almost made her forget why she'd run in the first place. But then the memory crashed over her like a wave. Isabella Rossi in his arms. His voice sang those terrible words that had driven her across the country. You know why I left? No, I don't. One day we were planning our future together, talking about the sustainable cities we'd design, the life we'd build. The next day you were gone. No explanation, no goodbye. Just an empty apartment and a forwarding address that led nowhere. Victoria stared at him in disbelief, wondering how he could stand there and pretend he didn't remember. Are you serious right now? You're going to stand there and pretend you don't remember that night? Isabella's surprise visit? What I walked in on. Alexander's face went pale, understanding dawning in his green eyes. Madonna mia, you saw us. I heard you too. Victoria's voice was barely controlled, 8 years of pain bleeding through her careful composure. I heard you tell her that I was your biggest mistake. That she was the one you'd always loved. Victoria, no. Alexander stepped closer, his eyes intense with something that looked almost like desperation. You don't understand what happened that night. I understand perfectly. Your ex-fiancée decided she wanted you back, and you couldn't get rid of me fast enough. Is that really what you think? That I would throw away what we had for Isabella? I know what I saw, Alexander. I know what I heard. Before he could respond, a small voice interrupted them from the doorway of room 314. Excuse me. Are you fighting about me? They both turned to see Sophia standing there, dragging her 4-pole behind her. She looked impossibly small in her hospital gown, but her dark eyes, Alexander's eyes, were bright with curiosity and intelligence that reminded Victoria painfully of the man standing beside her. Alexander's face went white as he looked at his daughter for the first time. He dropped to his knees right there in the corridor, staring at Sophia as if she were a miracle made flesh. Sophia. Her name was a whisper on his lips. That's me. Sophia tilted her head, studying the stranger with 8-year-old directness. Are you the doctor Mommy was talking to on the phone? Victoria's heart was breaking watching them meet, seeing so much of Alexander in their daughter that it was almost painful. Sophia had his stubborn chin, his expressive eyes, his way of tilting her head when she was thinking. No, sweetheart, Alexander said softly, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to control. I'm your father. Sophia's eyes widened like saucers. She looked from Alexander to Victoria and back again, processing this earth-shattering information with the gravity it deserved. My daddy? But Mommy said my daddy lived far away and couldn't visit. I didn't know about you, princess, Alexander said, the Italian endearment falling naturally from his lips. But I'm here now, and I'm never going to leave you again. Are you going to help me get better? Sophia asked with the straightforward pragmatism that had always astounded Victoria. Alexander's jaw clenched with determination, but his voice remained gentle. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you get well, Sophia. That's what fathers do. They protect their children. Sophia studied his face with the serious expression of a child trying to solve a complex puzzle. You have my eyes, she said finally. Alexander laughed, and it was the first genuine sound Victoria had heard from him since his arrival. Actually, you have mine, and your grandmother's chin. You would have loved her, princess. Mommy, is he really my daddy? Sophia asked, turning to Victoria with complete trust. Victoria knelt beside them, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously as she watched father and daughter meet for the first time. Yes, baby. He really is. Sophia looked at Alexander again, then did something that made both adults' hearts stop. She stepped forward and hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his neck with the unconscious trust that only children possess. Alexander's arms came around his daughter, and Victoria watched 8 years of anguish and regret crumble in his face. He buried his face in Sophia's dark hair, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs as he held the child he'd never known he had. I'm sorry I wasn't here before, he whispered against her hair. But I'm here now, and I'm going to take care of you. Dr. Kim chose that moment to appear with a clipboard and test results. Dr. Hayes, I see we have a visitor. This is Alexander Sterling, Victoria said stiffly, her professional mask sliding back into place. Sophia's biological father. Dr. Kim's face lit up with the kind of hope that only came when the impossible suddenly became possible. Perfect timing, Mr. Sterling. We'd like to run some compatibility tests to see if you're a suitable donor for Sophia. Whatever you need, Alexander said immediately, his arms still around his daughter. Take my blood, run every test you have. I'll do anything. Daddy, Sophia's small voice made them all turn. She was testing out the word as if seeing how it felt on her tongue. Will it hurt when you give me your kidney? Alexander's jaw clenched, but his voice was infinitely gentle. Maybe a little, princess. But I promise you, any pain I might feel would be nothing compared to the thought of losing you before I've even gotten to know you. Sophia nodded solemnly, processing this information with 8-year-old logic. Then she brightened, her natural optimism shining through. Can you stay with me while they do the tests? Mommy gets scared when they take my blood, but she tries to hide it. Alexander looked at Victoria, and for a moment, the years of hurt fell away. They were just two parents terrified for their child, united in their love for this brave little girl who was fighting for her life. If your mommy says it's okay, Alexander said carefully, not wanting to overstep boundaries he was still learning existed. Victoria wanted to say no. Every instinct told her to protect herself, to keep him at arm's length until she could process what his return meant for their carefully ordered lives. But looking at Sophia's hopeful face, she found herself nodding. He can stay. As they walked toward the laboratory, Sophia slipped her small hand into Alexander's large one with the easy trust of childhood. Daddy, will you tell me about where you live? Mommy says San Francisco has really tall buildings. I helped design some of those tall buildings, princess. And yes, I'll tell you all about them. Victoria watched them walk ahead of her, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. Sophia was already chattering away, telling Alexander about school and her friends and her favorite books about marine biology. And Alexander was listening with the intensity he'd once reserved for board meetings and product launches, hanging on every word as if his daughter's rambling stories were the most important things he'd ever heard. But even as warmth spread through her chest watching them together, Victoria couldn't forget the unfinished conversation between her and Alexander. His confusion about that night in Boston had seemed genuine, but how could he not remember? How could he not remember the words that had driven her 3,000 miles away and out of his life forever? The blood test results arrived the next morning with news that felt like cosmic intervention. Dr. Kim found Victoria and Alexander in the family waiting room, where they'd maintained careful distance while Sophia napped, the air between them heavy with unspoken words and 8 years of accumulated hurt. It's remarkable, Dr. Kim said, consulting her chart with barely contained excitement. Mr. Sterling, you're not just compatible, you're a perfect match. The genetic markers align in a way we rarely see, even between immediate family members. Alexander closed his eyes in relief so profound it seemed to drain the tension from his entire body. When can we do the surgery? We need to run additional tests to ensure you're healthy enough for the procedure, but if everything checks out, we could schedule it for early next week. After Dr. Kim left, Alexander and Victoria sat in silence, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them both. The surgery, the recovery, the inevitable conversations about their future, everything felt simultaneously urgent and impossible to contemplate. Alexander, Victoria began, but he held up a hand to stop her. Before you say anything, I need to tell you about that night. About what really happened in Boston. Victoria's jaw tightened, her defenses rising automatically. I don't want to hear your excuses. They're not excuses. They're the truth. And Sophia deserves to have parents who aren't carrying around 8 years of misunderstanding. Despite herself, Victoria found herself listening, Perhaps because the alternative was to continue living with the pain that had shaped so many of her decisions. Alexander leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white with tension. Isabella came to my apartment that night without warning. She was crying, hysterical. She told me she'd been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Whatever she'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. She said she was starting treatment, that she was terrified, that she didn't have anyone else to turn to. Her family had disowned her after our broken engagement, and she was facing this diagnosis completely alone. She begged me to be there for her as a friend, nothing more. "So you held her," Victoria said quietly, her voice lacking the accusatory edge it had carried moments before. "You comforted her." "I held her while she cried. Because despite everything that had gone wrong between us, I'd cared about her once, and she was scared and facing her own mortality." Alexander's voice was steady, but Victoria could see the pain in his eyes as he relived that night. She was desperate, Victoria. She was begging for someone to help her through treatment, to be there when she was sick and scared. "And you told her I was a mistake," Victoria whispered, the words still sharp and painful after all these years. Alexander's face contorted with pain and frustration. "No, Victoria. I told her that letting her manipulate me into ending our engagement 3 years earlier had been my mistake. That choosing my company over love, over building something real with someone, had been my mistake. I told her that you had shown me what real partnership felt like, and that I wouldn't, hurt you the way I'd hurt her by prioritizing everything else over love." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, rewriting 8 years of carefully constructed narrative in an instant. "What?" "I told Isabella that I was going to ask you to marry me, that I'd already bought the ring. I told her that you weren't a rebound or a consolation prize or a distraction from my grief over our failed relationship. You were the woman I wanted to build a life with, the person who'd taught me what it meant to truly love someone." Victoria stared at him, her world tilting on its axis as everything she'd believed about that night crumbled around her. "But I heard you say—" "You heard what you expected to hear," Alexander said gently, his voice filled with 8 years of regret. "Or maybe you heard what your fears told you to hear. But Victoria, I never called you a mistake. You were the best decision I'd ever made." The silence stretched between them as Victoria processed this revelation. 8 years of anger. 8 years of believing she'd been discarded like an inconvenient complication. 8 years of protecting herself from a pain that had been based on a complete misunderstanding. "The ring," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, worn smooth from years of being carried in his pocket. "I've had it with me every day since you disappeared. I kept thinking that somehow, someday, I'd find you and get the chance to explain what really happened that night." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the box that represented 8 years of what-ifs and might-have-beens. "Alexander, Daddy!" Sophia's voice interrupted them from the doorway. She was standing there in her hospital gown, looking pale but alert, her four-pole trailing behind her like a mechanical pet. "Can you come sit with me? The nurses are being boring, and I want to hear more stories about your buildings." Alexander immediately stood, slipping the ring box back into his pocket with practiced ease. "Of course, Princess. What would you like to do?" As they walked towards Sophia's room, Victoria followed behind them, her mind reeling from the revelation that had just turned her understanding of the past 8 years completely upside down. Everything she'd believed about that night, about Alexander's feelings for her, had been wrong. She'd run away from the man who'd been planning to propose to her. In Sophia's room, Alexander pulled a chair close to her bed while Victoria took her usual spot in the corner, trying to process the emotional earthquake that had just rearranged her entire mental landscape. What shall we do to chase away the boredom? Alexander asked, his voice automatically gentling when he spoke to their daughter. Tell me a story, Sophia said, settling back against her pillows with the expectant look of a child preparing to be entertained. Tell me about when you and Mommy first met. Alexander glanced at Victoria, who had taken her usual spot in the corner chair, her mind still spinning from their conversation. Well, it was in a very important meeting with lots of serious business people in expensive suits. Were you wearing an expensive suit too? Sophia asked with 8-year-old directness. The most expensive suit I owned, Alexander said solemnly, playing along with her curiosity. And I thought I was very important and impressive. Sophia giggled, a sound that never failed to warm Victoria's heart. But Mommy wasn't impressed? Your mommy walked into that conference room like she owned the entire building. She wore this blue dress that matched her eyes, and when she started talking about her sustainable housing designs. Alexander's voice grew soft with memory, his eyes finding Victoria's across the room. I forgot every word I'd planned to say. Victoria felt her cheeks warm as she remembered that day. She'd been nervous about the presentation, pitching her ideas for environmentally conscious urban development to a room full of skeptical investors. But Alexander's obvious admiration had given her confidence, had made her feel like the most brilliant person in the room. Did you know right away that you liked her? Sophia asked, clearly fascinated by this origin story she'd never heard before. I knew right away that she was going to change my life, Alexander said, his gaze still locked with Victoria's. I just didn't know how much. Sophia looked back and forth between her parents with the perceptive intelligence that sometimes surprised Victoria with its depth. So why didn't you get married back then? The question hung in the air like a challenge, highlighting the 8 years of separation that had kept their family apart. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, Victoria said softly, finding her voice for the first time since Alexander's revelation. Sometimes we don't communicate very well, and we hurt each other without meaning to. But you still love each other, Sophia said matter-of-factly, with the brutal honesty that only children possess. I can tell. Sophia, Victoria began, but her daughter held up a hand in a gesture that was pure Alexander, confident, commanding, brooking no argument. I'm 8, not stupid. I see how Daddy looks at you and how you look at him when you think he's not watching. And you both look sad, like you lost something really important. Alexander reached out and took Sophia's hand, his voice thick with emotion. You're very wise, Princess. I get that from Mommy. She's really smart. Did you know she designed the most beautiful building in all of San Francisco? The one with the gardens on every floor that helps clean the air. I'd love to see it, Alexander said, looking at Victoria with an expression she couldn't quite read. Maybe after I'm better, we can take a tour, Sophia suggested with the casual optimism of childhood. And Daddy, you can show us your buildings too. I want to see where you work and meet your friends. Would you like that, to visit my office? Alexander asked, his face lighting up at the prospect. Sophia's face lit up with excitement. Would I get to see where you work and meet your friends and see all the computers and everything? You'd get to see everything. I'd love to show you my world, Princess. As father and daughter continued talking, Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. Watching Alexander with Sophia was like seeing him in a completely new light. Gone was the driven, sometimes ruthless businessman she'd known 8 years ago. In his place was a man who spoke to their daughter with infinite patience, who listened to her rambling stories about school as if they were the most important things he'd ever heard. That evening, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Alexander and Victoria found themselves alone in the corridor again, the fluorescent lighting harsh and unforgiving as they finally confronted 8 years of misunderstanding. She's incredible, Alexander said softly, his voice filled with wonder and regret. She's brilliant and funny and brave, and she's perfect. I can't believe I missed 8 years of her life. She asks about you sometimes, Victoria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. About her father. I never knew what to tell her. You could have told her the truth. I thought I was protecting her from disappointment. From rejection. Victoria's voice broke slightly. I thought you'd chosen Isabella, and I couldn't bear the idea of you rejecting Sophia the same way you'd rejected me. Alexander turned to face her fully, his green eyes intense with emotion. Victoria, I searched for you for 2 years. I hired private investigators. I called every mutual contact we had in Boston and beyond. You disappeared so completely, it was like you'd never existed. I was pregnant and heartbroken and terrified, Victoria whispered, the words coming out in a rush. I thought you'd made your choice, and I couldn't face being discarded again. So I ran. And I thought you'd realized you didn't love me enough to trust me, to believe in what we had together. They stood there in the harsh hospital lighting, finally understanding the magnitude of their mutual misunderstanding. Two people who'd loved each other desperately, torn apart by a moment of misheard conversation and the fear that had kept them from fighting for what they'd had. What happens now? Victoria asked quietly, her voice trembling with vulnerability. Now I save our daughter's life, Alexander said firmly, his voice carrying the determination that had built a business empire. And then, if you'll let me, I'd like to try to earn your forgiveness. And maybe, if we're both brave enough this time, we can figure out how to be a family. Victoria looked at him through the tears that had been threatening to fall since his revelation about that night in Boston. Alexander, I need you to know something. I never stopped loving you. Even when I hated you, even when I convinced myself you'd betrayed me, I never stopped loving you. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, could see the gold flecks in his green eyes that Sophia had inherited. Then we'll find our way back to each other, he said, his voice soft but determined. However long it takes, however hard it is, we'll find our way back. He reached up and gently touched her cheek, and for a moment 8 years of hurt and misunderstanding melted away. They were just Alexander and Victoria again. Two people who'd found something rare and precious and nearly lost it to pride and miscommunication. For Sophia, Victoria said, leaning into his touch despite every self-protective instinct screaming at her to pull away. For Sophia, Alexander agreed. And for us. The surgery was scheduled for the following Friday, giving them a week to prepare for what Dr. Kim described as a routine procedure that would nevertheless change all their lives forever. Alexander submitted to a battery of additional tests while Sophia entertained herself by teaching him to fold origami cranes with the activity kit the hospital had provided. In Japan, they believe that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, your wish will come true, Sophia explained, her small fingers working carefully with the colorful paper as Alexander watched her with fascination. What are you wishing for, princess? Alexander asked, his own crane looking decidedly lopsided compared to his daughter's precise work. Sophia looked up at him with serious dark eyes that were so much like his own. I'm wishing that after the surgery, you won't have to go back to your old life without us. Alexander's hands stilled on his partially folded crane, the simple honesty of her words hitting him like a physical blow. What would you like to happen instead? I want us to be a real family, like Emma's family at school. She has a mommy and a daddy who live in the same house and make pancakes together on Sunday mornings and fight about silly things like whose turn it is to take out the garbage. Alexander glanced at Victoria, who was pretending to read a magazine in the corner but was obviously listening to every word of their conversation. That sounds like a very good wish, Sophia. But princess, wishes are complicated things. Sometimes they come true in ways we don't expect. Do you want to live with mommy and me? Sophia asked with the directness that never failed to astound both her parents. The question left Alexander speechless for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the intensity of his desire for exactly that threatened to overwhelm him. "More than anything in the world," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Sophia nodded approvingly and went back to her crane. "Then I think my wish has a good chance of coming true." Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the San Francisco fog rolling in from the Pacific like a soft gray blanket over the city. Victoria had barely slept, spending most of the night watching Sophia breathe and praying to every deity she could think of that everything would go according to plan. Alexander arrived at dawn, carrying coffee from the French bakery in Union Square and Sophia's favorite chocolate croissants. "How is she?" he asked quietly, setting the breakfast on the bedside table. "Scared, but trying to be brave," Victoria replied, studying his face. "How are you?" Alexander's smile was tight, but determined. Terrified, but ready. Sophia stirred as the aroma of chocolate filled the room, her eyes opening slowly as she emerged from sleep. "Is it surgery day?" she asked sleepily. "It is, Princess," Alexander said, sitting carefully on the edge of her bed. "But first, breakfast fit for a princess." As Sophia nibbled her croissant, Dr. Kim appeared with the surgical team for final preparations. The pre-surgery routine was a blur of medical procedures and consent forms, but throughout it all, Alexander never left Sophia's side. "Are you both ready?" Dr. Kim asked, her voice gentle but professional. Alexander nodded firmly. "More than ready." "Daddy," Sophia's small voice made everyone pause. "What if something goes wrong?" Alexander took her hands in his, looking directly into her eyes with the same intensity he'd once brought to billion-dollar negotiations. "Sophia, look at me. Do you remember what I promised you yesterday? That you'd be here when I wake up? That's right. And I keep my promises. No matter what happens in that operating room, I will be here when you open your eyes. We're going to get through this together, all three of us." Sophia studied his face with 8-year-old seriousness, then nodded solemnly. "I'm ready." The pre-surgery preparations moved with clinical efficiency. Alexander was prepped first, and as they wheeled him toward the operating room, he called out to Sophia with a voice that carried every ounce of love he'd accumulated in 8 years of not knowing her. "I love you, Princess. See you on the other side." "I love you too, Daddy." 30 minutes later, it was Sophia's turn. Victoria walked alongside the gurney, holding her daughter's hand as they moved through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and hope. "Mommy, will you be okay without me?" Sophia asked, her words slightly slurred from the pre-surgery medication. "I'll be right here waiting for you, baby. Both Daddy and I will be here. Promise you won't fight while I'm sleeping?" Victoria's heart clenched at the simple request. "I promise, sweetheart." As the operating room doors closed behind Sophia, Victoria finally allowed herself to break down. 8 years of being strong, of handling everything alone, of protecting herself and her daughter from disappointment, crashed over her in waves of terror and exhaustion. She found herself in the family waiting room, sobbing into her hands, when a gentle touch on her shoulder made her look up through her tears. It was Grace Sterling, Alexander's sister, whom Victoria remembered from their brief time together in Boston. Grace had the same green eyes as Alexander and Sophia, and the same quiet strength that had drawn Victoria to their family years ago. "Grace, how did you?" "Alexander called me yesterday. I flew in this morning." Grace sat beside her, wrapping Victoria in a warm hug that smelled of expensive perfume and sisterly comfort. "I'm here for all of you." "I'm so scared," Victoria whispered against Grace's shoulder, finally allowing herself to voice the terror that had been building since that first phone call from the school. "Of course you are. But Alexander is strong, And from what he tells me, Sophia is even stronger. They're both fighters, Victoria. And they have everything to fight for. Over the next 6 hours, Grace proved to be exactly what Victoria needed. A calm, steady presence who understood the magnitude of what was happening. She brought updates from the nurses, made sure Victoria ate something from the hospital cafeteria, and shared stories about Alexander's childhood that made Victoria laugh despite her anxiety. He used to build these elaborate smart homes out of cardboard boxes, Grace was saying, her voice warm with memory. He'd spend hours wiring them with Christmas lights and battery-powered fans, creating these miniature sustainable environments. Even as a kid, he was obsessed with making things better, more efficient, more beautiful. That sounds like him, Victoria said, managing a watery smile as she pictured a young Alexander lost in his architectural dreams. He never stopped talking about you, you know, Grace said quietly. After you disappeared. For months, he could barely function. He hired investigators, called everyone we knew, even flew to Seattle and San Francisco looking for any trace of you. Victoria felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. I didn't know. He was destroyed, Victoria. I'd never seen him like that. It was like someone had ripped out half his soul. Grace paused, choosing her words carefully. When he called to tell me about Sophia, about the surgery, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in 8 years. Before Victoria could respond, Dr. Kim finally appeared in the waiting room doorway, still in her surgical scrubs but wearing a smile that immediately eased the knot of terror in Victoria's chest. The surgery went beautifully, Dr. Kim announced, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. Both Alexander and Sophia are in recovery, and everything looks perfect. Victoria's legs gave out with relief so profound it felt like her bones had turned to water. Grace caught her arm, steadying her as the fear that had been holding her together for hours finally released its grip. When can I see them? Alexander should be waking up in about an hour. Sophia will take a bit longer. Her surgery was more complex, but she's stable and her new kidney is already functioning beautifully. The recovery room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the hushed conversations of medical staff. Alexander lay still and pale in the hospital bed, but his breathing was steady and strong. When Victoria took his hand, his eyes fluttered open almost immediately. Sophia? His voice was hoarse from the breathing tube, but the concern in his eyes was crystal clear. She's perfect, Victoria said, tears streaming down her face as 8 hours of terror finally found release. The surgery was a complete success. Dr. Kim says her new kidney is working beautifully. Alexander closed his eyes in relief so profound it seemed to drain all the tension from his body. Thank God. How do you feel? Like someone removed one of my organs, he said with a weak smile that was pure Alexander, finding humor even in his most vulnerable moment. But also like I've never been happier in my life. Over the next few days, Victoria split her time between 2 hospital rooms, watching both Alexander and Sophia recover from the surgery that had saved their daughter's life and somehow begun to heal their fractured family. Alexander recovered quickly, his natural resilience and determination serving him well. Sophia's recovery was slower but steady, her small body gradually accepting and adapting to its life-saving gift. On the 3rd day post-surgery, the doctors decided Alexander was well enough to visit Sophia in her room. He moved carefully, still sore from the surgery, but his face lit up with pure joy when he saw his daughter sitting up in bed, coloring in a sketch pad with renewed energy. "Daddy!" Sophia's face beamed with happiness that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "Look, I'm drawing our house." Alexander looked at the crayon drawing she held up, a house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. A tall man, a woman with long dark hair, and a small girl between them, all holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Our house? Alexander asked, settling carefully into the chair beside her bed. The house we're going to live in when we get out of the hospital. It has a big kitchen for making pancakes and a workshop where you can design buildings and a garden where Mommy can grow flowers. Sophia's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she'd already worked out all the details of their future life together. Alexander looked at Victoria over Sophia's head. They hadn't discussed living arrangements, hadn't talked about the practical realities of blending their lives after 8 years apart, but Sophia, in her 8-year-old wisdom, had already mapped out their future with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what a family should look like. That sounds like a perfect house, Alexander said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I drew it in San Francisco because that's where Mommy's job is. But maybe sometimes we can visit Boston so I can see your office there too. Maybe we can, Alexander agreed, though his mind was already working through the logistics of relocating his entire operation to the West Coast. That evening, after Sophia had fallen asleep clutching her drawing, Alexander and Victoria found themselves alone together for the first time since the surgery. The weight of what they'd been through, what they'd learned about each other, hung between them like a bridge they weren't sure they were ready to cross. She's remarkable, Alexander said, watching their daughter sleep peacefully. She's been through major surgery, and she's already planning our future with the confidence of a seasoned architect. She gets that from you, Victoria said softly. The ability to see possibilities where others see obstacles. The determination to make things happen. Alexander turned to look at her, his green eyes serious in the dim hospital lighting. Victoria, about what Sophia said, about living together, I don't want you to feel pressured. I don't feel pressured, Victoria interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I feel hopeful. For the first time in 8 years, I feel like maybe we can really do this. You mean it? Instead of answering with words, Victoria leaned over and kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, 8 years of hurt and careful distance melting away in the connection between them. Then deeper as 8 years of longing and love and forgiveness poured out in the kiss they'd both been afraid to hope for. When they broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I love you, he whispered. I never stopped loving you. I love you too, she whispered back. Even when I hated you, even when I convinced myself you'd betrayed me, I loved you. The next morning brought wonderful news that felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. Sophia's kidney function was excellent, exceeding all expectations, and both patients were cleared to go home within the week. Home, Sophia said thoughtfully as Dr. Kim explained the discharge procedures and follow-up care. Will we all go to the same home? Alexander and Victoria exchanged glances laden with 8 years of complexity and hope. They talked late into the night about logistics, about Alexander relocating his primary operations to San Francisco, about blending their lives after so many years of careful separation. We're working on that, Princess, Alexander said carefully. But yes, I think we can arrange for us all to go to the same home. Sophia clapped her hands together with delight. Good, because I have plans for us. Oh, really? Victoria laughed, recognizing the determined expression that meant their daughter had been plotting. What kind of plans? Well, first we need to have a tea party so I can introduce Daddy to all my stuffed animals properly. Then we need to make pancakes together like a real family. And then, Sophia's face grew serious with 8-year-old gravity. Then we need to have a wedding. A wedding? Victoria nearly choked on her coffee. You can't live in the same house unless you're married, Sophia explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. Emma's mom told me that's the rule. Alexander looked at Victoria, his eyes twinkling with the mischief she remembered from their early days together. Well, we certainly can't break Emma's mom's rules. Alexander, Victoria warned, but she was fighting a smile that threatened to break free despite her best efforts. Actually, Princess, I've been carrying something around for a long time, waiting for the right moment. Alexander carefully reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the worn velvet box that had traveled with him for 8 years, through board meetings and international flights and sleepless nights when he'd wondered if he'd ever see Victoria again. Sophia's eyes widened with excitement. Is that a ring box? It is indeed. Alexander got down on one knee beside Sophia's hospital bed, wincing slightly from his recent surgery but moving with the determination that had built an empire. Victoria Hayes. 8 years ago, I bought this ring because I knew I wanted to spend my life with you. I've carried it every day since, hoping for a second chance. Victoria's hands flew to her mouth as Alexander opened the box, revealing a stunning emerald surrounded by diamonds, the same green as both his and Sophia's eyes, the color of new growth and second chances. I know we have a lot to work through, a lot of trust to rebuild, but Sophia is right. We need to be a real family. So, will you marry me? Will you let me love you and Sophia for the rest of our lives? Say yes, Mommy. Sophia bounced excitedly in her bed, her recovery forgotten in the excitement of the moment. Say yes so we can have the tea party. Through her tears, Victoria laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to chase away the last shadows of 8 years of pain. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook with emotion, then leaned up to kiss her while Sophia cheered from her hospital bed with the enthusiasm of someone whose most important wish had just come true. This is the best day ever, Sophia declared with absolute certainty. Even better than Christmas. As Alexander and Victoria held each other, both crying and laughing at the same time, they knew that Sophia was absolutely right. It was the best day ever, the day their family finally found its way back together, stronger and more precious for having been broken and healed. 3 weeks later, Victoria stood in the doorway of their Pacific Heights home, the same Victorian house she'd bought when Sophia was 2, but now it felt completely transformed by the presence of the 2 people who made it truly home. Alexander's architectural plans were spread across the dining room table, his coffee mug sat next to hers on the kitchen counter, and his laughter echoed from the living room where he was having a very serious tea party with Sophia and her extensive collection of stuffed animals. Mr. Buttons would like more sugar in his tea, Sophia announced with the solemnity of a practiced hostess. Of course, Alexander replied with equal gravity. One must never serve Mr. Buttons unsweetened tea. It's simply not done. Victoria smiled, watching the man who commanded billion-dollar tech companies negotiate the complex social hierarchy of stuffed animal etiquette with the same focus he'd once brought to board meetings. Recovery had been a journey for all of them. Alexander learning to be a father, Sophia adjusting to having a dad who was suddenly present for every bedtime story and homework session, and Victoria learning to trust again, to let someone else share the burden of protecting and providing for their daughter. The first week had been the hardest. Alexander, still healing from surgery, had stayed in the guest room, giving Victoria space while being close enough to help with Sophia's recovery. They'd moved carefully around each other, polite but distant, 8 years of hurt not easily erased by a hospital proposal and shared relief. It was Sophia who'd broken through their careful politeness with the directness that never failed to astound both her parents. "Why are you and Daddy acting like strangers?" she'd asked one morning over breakfast in the sunny kitchen overlooking the bay. "You're supposed to be in love." "Grown-up love is complicated, sweetheart," Victoria had tried to explain, stirring her coffee and avoiding Alexander's eyes across the table. "No, it's not," Sophia had replied with 8-year-old certainty. "You either love someone or you don't. And you both love each other. I can see it in your eyes when you think I'm not looking. So stop being scared and act like it." out of the mouths of babes. That afternoon, Victoria had found Alexander on the back deck, sketching ideas for a treehouse he wanted to build for Sophia in their small garden. The fog was rolling in from the Pacific, softening the edges of the city beyond their quiet neighborhood. "She's right, you know," Victoria had said, settling beside him on the outdoor sofa. "About what?" "About us being scared. I've been so afraid of getting hurt again that I've been holding back, protecting myself instead of building something new with you." Alexander had set down his pencil and looked at her with eyes that held 8 years of regret and hope. "I've been afraid too. Afraid that if I push too hard, too fast, you'll realize this was all a mistake and disappear again." "I'm not going anywhere, Alexander. We're not 26 anymore. We're parents now, and Sophia needs us to figure this out." "What do you need?" he'd asked softly, his voice carrying the patience she was slowly learning to trust again. "I need you to be patient with me. I need time to trust that this is real, that you're really here to stay." "I have all the time in the world," he'd promised. "However long it takes." And he'd been true to his word. Alexander courted her all over again, bringing her coffee in the morning, listening to her work stories about the affordable housing project that was finally moving forward, sharing his own dreams about transitioning Sterling Enterprises towards sustainable technology development. He learned Sophia's routines and preferences, her favorite bedtime stories about marine biologists and deep-sea exploration, her inexplicable fear of butterflies, and her passionate love of anything related to ocean conservation. Most importantly, he'd been patient. When Victoria flinched away from his touch one evening while watching a movie, he'd simply squeezed her hand and said, "It's okay. We'll get there." And slowly, carefully, they did. The breakthrough came on a foggy Thursday evening 3 weeks after they'd all come home from the hospital. Sophia had been asleep for hours, and Alexander was working late on his laptop while Victoria read beside him on the couch, the fire crackling in the fireplace they'd finally learned to use together. She'd looked up to find him watching her with an expression of such profound contentment that it took her breath away. "What?" she'd asked, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "I was just thinking about how many evenings I dreamed of exactly this," he'd said softly. "You reading beside me, Sophia safe and healthy down the hall, all of us together in a real home." Something in his voice, the raw vulnerability of it, the weight of 8 years of longing, broke through her last defenses. "Alexander," she'd whispered, setting down her book. "I know," he'd said, understanding immediately what she couldn't put into words. "I know you're not ready." She'd silenced him with a kiss that poured 8 years of longing and forgiveness between them, tasting like coffee and second chances and the future they were finally brave enough to build together. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, she'd rested her forehead against his and whispered the words that had been building in her chest for weeks. "I'm ready to stop being afraid." 6 weeks later, their backyard was transformed into Sophia's vision of wedding perfection. The small garden behind their Victorian house bloomed with 6 varieties of flowers that created a rainbow arch under which Alexander and Victoria would exchange the vows they'd been practicing in private for weeks. A 3-tiered cake, not quite as tall as Alexander but impressive nonetheless, sat on a table decorated with more flowers and fairy lights strung between the cypress trees that bordered their property. Sophia, resplendent in a pink dress she'd chosen herself after extensive deliberation, served as both flower girl and wedding coordinator, directing the small gathering of family and friends with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this event since she was old enough to understand what marriage meant. "Okay, everyone," she announced, consulting the detailed list she'd written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. "Daddy, you stand here by the flowers. Aunt Grace, start the music." Grace, who had flown in from Boston with Alexander's parents, pressed play on the carefully curated playlist Sophia had assembled over weeks of serious consideration. As the opening notes of Can't Help Myself filled the air, Sophia's current favorite song, Alexander took his place under the flower arch, his hands straightening his tie nervously despite having been through countless high-stakes business presentations. The back door opened, and Victoria appeared, radiant in a simple cream dress that Alexander had never seen but that somehow perfectly captured her elegance and the understated grace he'd fallen in love with 9 years ago. Sophia had insisted on walking her down the aisle, and they made their way across the small lawn hand in hand, both of them smiling through tears of joy. "Take care of my mommy," Sophia whispered seriously to Alexander as she delivered Victoria to his side with the solemnity of someone passing on a sacred trust. "Always," Alexander promised, his voice thick with emotion as he took Victoria's hands in his. When it came time for vows, Alexander spoke first, his voice carrying across their intimate gathering of the people who mattered most. "Victoria, 8 years ago, I thought I'd lost you forever. I spent those years learning that success means nothing without someone to share it with. That innovation is hollow without love. That all the smart buildings in the world can't replace the home I found in your arms." His voice grew thick with emotion as he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "You gave me the greatest gift I could ever receive, our daughter. And now you're giving me another gift, the chance to be the man you and Sophia deserve. I promise to love you both with everything I have for all the days of my life." Victoria wiped tears from her eyes before speaking, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions threatening to overtake her. "Alexander, I spent 8 years convincing myself that I was stronger alone, that Sophia and I didn't need anyone else. But love isn't about need, it's about choice. And I choose you every day for the rest of our lives. I choose the laughter you bring to our home, the patience you show our daughter, the way you make ordinary moments feel magical. I choose us, our beautiful, complicated, perfect family." As they exchanged rings, Sophia beamed with satisfaction from her place of honor beside the officiant, her face glowing with the happiness of someone whose most important wish had just come true. "You may kiss the bride," Pastor Williams announced with a smile. Alexander cupped Victoria's face in his hands and kissed her deeply, 8 years of separation dissolving in that perfect moment of reunion and promise. Their guests cheered, and Sophia threw handfuls of flower petals into the air with such enthusiasm that the rainbow of colors seemed to dance around them like blessing. "And now," Sophia announced as they broke apart, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd orchestrated the entire event, "we eat cake and dance and live happily ever after." "Is that how it works?" Alexander asked, scooping Sophia up in his arms and spinning her around until she squealed with laughter. "That's exactly how it works," Sophia said with absolute confidence. "I read it in all the best books." As the sun set over San Francisco Bay, casting golden light across their backyard reception, Alexander danced with his new wife while Sophia spun in circles nearby, her princess dress twirling around her legs like something from the fairy tales she'd always believed would come true. Their family and friends mingled on the small lawn, sharing stories and laughter and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing something truly special. But the most important moment came when the three of them danced together, Alexander and Victoria swaying slowly to music that seemed to emanate from their hearts while Sophia stood on Alexander's feet, all of them laughing as they moved in perfect synchronization. "Are we really a family now?" Sophia asked, looking up at her parents with eyes that sparkled with happiness and the security that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. "We've always been a family, Princess," Alexander said, his voice soft with wonder at how perfectly the pieces of his life had finally fallen into place. "We just needed time to find our way back to each other." "And now we never have to be apart again?" Victoria and Alexander exchanged glances over their daughter's head, both thinking of the long journey that had brought them to this moment. The heartbreak, the misunderstanding, the years of separation, the fear and the hope and the love that had somehow survived it all and emerged stronger. "Never again," Victoria promised, her voice carrying the weight of a vow that went deeper than any wedding ceremony. And as their guests began to leave and the fairy lights twinkled in the growing darkness, the three of them sat together on their back deck, Sophia curled up between her parents, all of them looking out at the twinkling lights of the city they now called home together. The fog was rolling in from the Pacific, softening the edges of the urban landscape beyond their quiet neighborhood, and in the distance, the Golden Gate Bridge glowed like a promise against the darkening sky. Sometimes, Victoria thought as she leaned against Alexander's shoulder and felt their daughter's steady breathing against her arm, the best love stories are the ones that start with heartbreak and end with healing. The ones that prove that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about having the courage to make things right. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, love gives you a second chance to get it right. 1 year later, Sophia ran through Golden Gate Park with boundless energy, her new kidney working perfectly, chasing Alexander while Victoria watched from their picnic blanket, her hand resting on her growing belly. Their second child, a little boy they'd already decided to name James, was due in 3 months. "Again, Daddy. Again!" Sophia called out, her laughter echoing across the park. "The baby's going to love having such an energetic big sister," Victoria said as Alexander collapsed beside her, breathless and grinning. "Speaking of which," Alexander said, pulling Sophia onto his lap, "should we tell her the news today?" "Tell me what?" Sophia appeared instantly alert, her curiosity sensor fully activated. "You're going to be a big sister, princess." Sophia's scream of joy could probably be heard in Oakland. "Now, I want you to think about something. What would you have done in Victoria's situation? When your child's life hangs in the balance, how far would you go? Would you swallow your pride to save the person you love most? Drop a comment below and tell me your answer. Because somewhere out there, someone is facing an impossible choice, and they need to know they're not alone. This story isn't just about second chances, it's about the courage to choose love over fear, hope over hurt, and family over everything else that doesn't matter. If this story moved your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe that broken things can be made whole again. Because the best love stories aren't the ones that never face obstacles. They're the ones that find their way back to each other, stronger than before. Subscribe for more stories that remind you that no matter how shattered something seems, love always finds a way to heal what matters most. Because sometimes the person who broke your heart is the only one who can truly make it whole again. Your story isn't over. Your second chance might be just a phone call away.